You were mid-sentence, the name was right there. You could see the face, you knew where you met them, you could describe what they do, where they live, who introduced you. Every detail was available, every piece of context present in the conversation, and the one word the moment required sat somewhere behind a door that would not open. You went through the alphabet. You circled the conversation around the gap, hoping the name would surface before anyone noticed the pause. Nothing came. 20 minutes later, in the car doing nothing, thinking about nothing in particular, the name arrived. Complete. Unbidden. As though the system that searches your memory needed 20 minutes to find what was never missing. You have carried a quiet fear about moments like that. A fear that the name was gone. That the forgetting was the first signal of something irreversible, something deeper than ordinary aging, something you have watched happen to a person you love. The fear is specific to your generation. You have seen what memory loss looks like at its worst. And the gap between the question and the name, the pause that stretches longer each year, feeds a worry that the pause is the beginning. Nearly everyone over 55 has carried this fear in some quiet moment. The physics resolves it. Every name was always stored. The search engine that retrieves it slowed down. The hard drive is intact. Every name you have ever learned, every face you have matched to that name, every detail you associated with that person remains encoded in the synaptic pattern that stored it. The retrieval computation, the process of activating the correct pattern among millions, takes longer to execute at 60 than it did at 30. The data is untouched. 60% of peak. That is the processor speed at 60. But that answer, the general slowing, leaves something unexplained. Faces rarely fail like this. Facts rarely do. Vocabulary improves with age, and skills remain intact for decades. Names fail first, and they fail disproportionately. If the entire retrieval system slowed equally, everything would fail equally. Something about names makes them the weakest retrieval in the entire network. What that something is and why it makes names uniquely vulnerable to the slowing requires a physics the general answer cannot reach. Two separate processes can prevent you from accessing a stored memory, and distinguishing between them is the most important piece of physics. The 55-year-old brain has never been taught. One means the memory was destroyed. The other means the search took too long. They feel identical in the moment you stand in the conversation, unable to produce the name. They are completely different at the level of the hardware. Storage failure means the memory trace itself is gone. Hippocampal neurons that encoded the pattern have died. Synaptic connections that held the name physically dissolved. The data has been erased from the hardware. No amount of time, queuing, or context will recover it, because the pattern no longer exists in the network. This is the physics of neurodegenerative disease, and it is the physics you feared when the name would not come. Retrieval failure means the memory trace is intact, but the search that locates it takes longer than the moment allows. The synaptic pattern exists. The name is stored, the connections that encoded it are present and functional. The computation that activates the correct pattern among millions of stored patterns requires more processing time than it did at 30. The processor slowed. The question is what slowed it? The difference between these two failures is the difference between a hard drive that has been erased and a search engine that takes longer to return a result. The hard drive in your case is intact. Proof arrives through a phenomenon you already know. And the proof is worth understanding precisely because it resolves the fear. When you stand in the conversation and you can describe everything about a person except their name, you are demonstrating partial activation of the memory network. Semantic nodes have fired: profession, appearance, location, context, spouse's name, the restaurant where you last met. Activation is spreading through the network toward the name node. The name has not yet crossed the threshold for conscious retrieval, but the network surrounding the name is active. You can feel the activation, you know the name is close. The sensation of almost retrieving is the sensation of a network that has activated every node except the final one. The partial activation is itself the proof that the network is intact, because a destroyed network cannot partially activate. A destroyed memory produces no sensation of closeness, no feeling that the answer is near, no partial information about the missing word. The tip of the tongue sensation is retrieval in progress, and the strength of that sensation tells you how close the search has come to completing. When the name surfaces the delay later, the proof is complete. The data was always there. A destroyed memory does not arrive in the car. A destroyed memory does not surface during a shower. A destroyed memory is gone permanently because the synaptic pattern that stored it no longer exists. The name that arrives unbidden, the delay after the failed search, is a computation that completed after the search was given more time and more processing bandwidth. The search completed after the conscious attempt ended. The search was slow, so the retrieval slowed. But why does the system take longer at 60 than at 30? Every retrieval across every category of stored information takes longer at 60 than at 30, but names fail disproportionately, fail specifically, fail in a way the general slowing alone cannot account for. That question sits open while the physics of the slowing itself comes into focus. What physical changes add milliseconds to a computation that used to complete in an instant? Salthouse documented the answer in Psychological Review in what became the most cited paper in cognitive aging research. Processing speed declines approximately 1 to 2% per year, beginning in the late 20s. By 60, the computational speed available for every cognitive operation, including memory retrieval, has dropped 30 to 40% from its peak. Measured in milliseconds across thousands of subjects. Replicated across dozens of laboratories over 3 decades. The decline is continuous, gradual, and universal, affecting every person who ages regardless of education, occupation, or cognitive activity level. The rate varies between individuals, the direction does not. 3 physical changes drive the millisecond accumulation, and each one is measurable independently. Myelin integrity declines. Myelin is the insulating sheath wrapped around the axons that carry electrical signals between brain regions, the biological equivalent of the insulation around an electrical wire. Bartzokis mapped the progression in neurobiology of aging. The sheath thins with age, particularly in the prefrontal white matter tracts that connect the retrieval processing regions to the hippocampal memory stores. Thinner insulation means slower conduction velocity, measurable in meters per second. A myelinated axon at 30 conducts signals at approximately 100 meters per second. The same axon at 60 with thinner myelin conducts at approximately 80 to 85 meters per second. The 15 to 20% reduction in conduction velocity applies to every signal traveling between every processing region involved in the retrieval computation. A retrieval computation that required signals to pass through 12 relay points completes each relay in slightly less time at 40 than at 60, and the difference at each relay is small enough to be invisible in isolation. The accumulated delay across 12 relays, small per relay, measurable per computation, perceptible per conversation. You experience the accumulated relay delay as the fraction of a second between the question and the beginning of the answer, the pause that was instantaneous at 30 and detectable at 60. The delay is a slower relay completing the identical signal transfer the faster relay completed at 30. Now, synaptic density decreases. Fewer connections between neurons means fewer parallel search paths through the memory network. At 30, the retrieval system runs a search through approximately 1,000 simultaneous pathways. At 60, the number drops to approximately 800. 20% fewer parallel paths means the correct path takes longer to find because fewer routes are being explored simultaneously. The reduction is bandwidth loss in the computational sense. The processor can still find the answer, but it searches fewer routes at once, and the route that leads to the name takes longer to reach because fewer paths are heading toward it. Dopamine concentration declines at approximately 10% per decade after 20. Dopamine amplifies the signal-to-noise ratio during retrieval, strengthening the activation of the correct pattern relative to the competing activation of similar patterns stored nearby in the network. Lower dopamine means the correct name's activation signal rises more slowly above the noise of partially matching names. The discrimination task takes longer because the signal that says, "This is the correct name," is quieter relative to the signals from similar names, saying, "What about me?" instead. The processor must wait longer for the correct signal to separate from the noise, and that waiting is measured in the milliseconds you experience as the pause. The dopamine decline is the quietest of the 3 changes, invisible to any scan or test you would encounter in a clinical setting, but it adds measurably to every retrieval computation the system performs. Each factor adds milliseconds independently, and all 3 compound against the same retrieval. A computation that completed in 200 milliseconds at 30 may require 600 milliseconds at 60. Still successful, still accurate, and the name arrives. But the additional 400 milliseconds crosses the threshold you experience as the pause, the hesitation, the blank you quietly interpret as the beginning of something worse. The computation completes. The speed at which it completes has changed. The accuracy has not. Well, the lag I experience at my own age carries a different weight after learning those numbers. 400 milliseconds between the question and the answer is the measurable cost of 3 independent physical changes operating on a system that still finds what it searches for. The pause is physics. Processing speed is half the story. The problem compounds from a second direction that has nothing to do with speed. A 60-year-old brain stores more names, faces, facts, events, places, skills, and associations than a 30-year-old brain. 3 additional decades of living have filled the memory network with material the retrieval system must search through every time you try to recall a name. A slower processor searching a larger database, both curves moving against retrieval simultaneously, and neither one reversible. Signal-to-noise scales with the database in a way that makes the retrieval harder than either factor alone would predict. Each stored name creates activation patterns that partially overlap with other names sharing phonological or semantic features. More names in storage means more interference during every retrieval attempt. Searching for Johnson partially activates Johnston, Johansson, Jackson, Jefferson, and every other name sharing the initial phoneme or the rhythm of 2 syllables with emphasis on the first. The discrimination task, finding the one correct pattern among dozens of partial matches rising simultaneously in the network, grows harder as the stored catalog grows. The noise floor rises with every name you learn across every year of living. At 30, the system searched approximately 5,000 stored names at full processing speed with a high signal-to-noise ratio. At 60, the system searches approximately 15,000 names at 60% of that speed with a lower signal-to-noise ratio from both the dopamine decline and the increased interference. The retrieval lag is computational difficulty, the predictable outcome of a larger search space explored by a slower processor through a noisier signal environment. The physics produces exactly the experience you recognize. The name is in there, you know it is in there, and the system needs more time to find it among 15,000 candidates than it needed to find it among 5,000. The knowledge that the name exists, the certainty that you know this person, the frustration of the gap between knowing and producing, all of it is the experience of a retrieval computation running correctly but slowly through a database 3 times larger than the one the system searched at 30. Processor slowed, database grew, but the system does not stop working when the conscious search gives up. When you abandon the search and change the subject, the retrieval computation continues beneath conscious awareness. Subconscious spreading activation, the process by which partial activation from the failed search propagates through the memory network at low levels, continues exploring pathways the conscious search could not complete under time pressure. The network does not reset when you stop trying. The activation pattern you built during the conscious search persists, each partially activated node continuing to send low-level signals to its neighbors, gradually pushing activation through indirect routes toward the name node. Adjacent nodes activate slowly. Connections that were too weak to fire under the time pressure of the conversation accumulate enough energy from the slow background propagation to reach their firing threshold over minutes rather than seconds. The activation inches toward the name through pathways the original search did not have time to explore, pathways that require more processing time than a conversation allows, but less than the background system needs to find the answer through a longer indirect route. The search is running at low priority, consuming whatever computational resources the brain can spare from conscious tasks, progressing steadily toward a threshold it will cross when the conditions are right, and then during low cognitive load, driving on a familiar route, showering, walking without conversation, the prefrontal cortex releases the directed attention it was applying to other tasks. Processing bandwidth frees up. The background search, which has been running at low priority with whatever computational resources were left over from conscious processing, suddenly receives the bandwidth it needed. The computation completes. The name crosses the retrieval threshold and surfaces into conscious awareness as though it arrived from nowhere. It arrived from a search that never stopped running. The brain allocated the task to a background process when the foreground process stalled, and the background process completed the work when the system freed enough bandwidth to finish the computation. Every name that has ever arrived in the car, in the shower, during a walk, is evidence of a retrieval system that continued working after the conscious attempt ended. The system is slower. The system is functional. The 20-minute delay between the question and the answer is the processing time the computation required, not a sign that the computation failed. Every retrieval takes longer: faces, facts, directions, vocabulary. Everything the retrieval system searches for requires more processing time at 60 than at 30. But names fail disproportionately. You can describe everything about a person, their height, their profession, their street, their spouse's name, and produce nothing when asked for their name. Face, context, and relationship are all there. Every node in the memory network for that person is accessible except the name. Failure this specific cannot be explained with general slowing alone. The general slowing explains the 400 milliseconds of additional processing time. The names question, why this specific category fails before all others, requires the computational physics of network connectivity. Why do names fail first when the whole system slowed? Names are arbitrary labels. Richard has no semantic connection to the person it labels, no visual connection, no logical derivation, no associative link to any property of the person it identifies. The label was assigned randomly by parents who chose it before meeting their child, and it connects to the person through a single thread, the learned association between the sound of the name and the identity of the individual. No other memory you carry about a person is this weakly connected to the network that stores it. Every other piece of information about that person was encoded through experience, through observation, through repeated encounters that built multiple pathways between the information and the rest of what you know about them. Every other descriptor has rich associative connections running through multiple memory systems simultaneously. Tall connects to the visual processing system, to stored images of the person standing in a room, to height comparisons with other people you know, to the physical sensation of looking up during conversation. The visual memory alone provides multiple independent pathways to the descriptor. Engineer connects to profession, to education, to workplace, to conversations about their projects, to other engineers you know, to the concept of engineering itself. Each connection provides an independent pathway the retrieval system can use. Oak Street connects to spatial memory, to visual memory of the neighborhood, to driving routes stored in the hippocampal place cell system, to the map of the area you navigate regularly, to the experience of turning onto that street during visits. Each descriptor is anchored to the memory network through dozens of independent connections running through multiple brain regions. When you search for any of these descriptors, the retrieval system has multiple entry points, multiple redundant pathways leading to the information from different directions. Names connect through one pathway. One arbitrary association between a sound and a person, stored in a single connection that has no backup, no redundancy, no alternative route the retrieval system can use if the primary path fails. In the language of network analysis, every memory network for a person can be drawn as a graph with nodes and connections. The nodes for appearance, profession, location, context, and personality are densely connected, each one reachable through multiple routes from multiple other nodes. The node for the name sits at the periphery, connected by a single edge, the least connected node in the entire graph. When the system operates at full bandwidth, the single connection is sufficient because the retrieval system can reach even poorly connected nodes through fast, efficient search. When bandwidth declines, the most vulnerable nodes are the ones with the fewest connections, because they depend entirely on a single pathway that has no redundancy if the pathway fails or takes too long. Well, when the retrieval system loses the parallel search paths that synaptic density decline removed, the nodes with rich connections survive because the system can reach them through redundant routes. The search finds tall through the visual route, or the contextual route, or the spatial route. If one path fails under the bandwidth reduction, another succeeds. The name, reachable through only one pathway, has zero redundancy. When that single path fails under the slowing or takes longer than the conversation allows, the retrieval fails entirely because no backup route exists. Every other piece of information about that person has multiple backup routes. The name has none. The asymmetry between how names are stored and how every other piece of information is stored is the asymmetry the retrieval system reveals under load. The name is the first retrieval to fail because it was always the least connected, the most dependent on a single pathway, the most vulnerable to any reduction in the system's capacity to search. This is why you can describe everything about a person except their name. The descriptors are richly connected and survive the slowing through their redundant pathways. The name is poorly connected and has no alternative route. Burke and colleagues established this hierarchy in the Journal of Memory and Language, confirming that proper names are retrieved more slowly than any other category of stored information across every age group tested, and the gap between names and other categories widens with age because the single pathway vulnerability compounds with the bandwidth reduction that affects every pathway in the network. The name I could not produce at dinner last week, the one I knew was stored because I could describe the street, the spouse, the profession, everything except the word itself, was the least connected node in the network, doing exactly what the physics predicts under reduced bandwidth. The pause carried a fear I no longer carry. What fails first maps exactly to the connectivity of each node in the network. Names sit at the bottom because arbitrary labels have the fewest connections. Faces sit near the top because visual memory is richly connected through multiple processing streams. Facts sit in the middle, connected through semantic associations of varying strength. Skills sit highest because procedural memories are encoded through motor pathways with deep redundancy built into the cerebellar circuits. The system is revealing which links were weakest, and names were always the most fragile because they were always the least connected. You have been quietly carrying a fear about a retrieval failure that is the predicted outcome of searching for the least connected node in a massive database with a processor running at reduced capacity. Names fail first because they were always the weakest links in the network, the nodes with the fewest connections, the retrievals with zero redundancy. The fear was understandable, the physics behind the failure is ordinary, and the relief is complete. Can anything maintain the search speed as the processor declines? 3 inputs operate directly on the computational system that searches through them, each targeting a different component of the retrieval physics. Aerobic exercise releases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that strengthens synaptic connections in the hippocampal retrieval network, the structure that stores the associative patterns the retrieval system searches through. Erickson and colleagues demonstrated in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that 1 year of walking increased hippocampal volume by 2%, and improved memory task performance measurably. The walking discussion described this finding from a different direction. The hippocampus physically grew, adding synaptic connections that expanded the network the retrieval system searches through. More synaptic connections in the hippocampus means more parallel search paths through the memory network, directly addressing the bandwidth reduction that makes retrieval slower at 60 than at 30. The exercise operates on the hardware itself. More connections means more routes to every stored memory, including the single weak connection that names depend on. Even a marginal strengthening of that single thread reduces the probability that the retrieval will fail for the least connected nodes, the names that sit at the bottom of the connectivity hierarchy. Novel learning provides sustained processing demand on the prefrontal hippocampal retrieval circuit. Regular novel demand from a new language, a new instrument, a new skill, a new route through an unfamiliar neighborhood, forces the retrieval system to operate under computational load, maintaining processing speed through use. A retrieval system that runs easy, familiar searches exclusively loses processing capacity, the way a muscle that lifts only light weights loses strength. Novel demand keeps the processor running at a speed closer to its capacity by requiring the system to search, discriminate, and retrieve under conditions that challenge the current processing speed. The demand must be genuinely novel, requiring the retrieval system to build new pathways and strengthen new connections rather than repeating familiar retrievals. The system has already optimized into low-effort routines. What happens to the weakest connections overnight? Sleep during slow-wave phases reorganizes the retrieval architecture and strengthens the weakest connections in the network. During deep sleep, the hippocampus replays the day's encoding events, sending the stored patterns through the cortical network for consolidation and reinforcement. The replay strengthens the connections the daytime retrieval system found weakest through long-term potentiation, the process by which repeated activation of a synaptic connection physically increases the density of receptors at the postsynaptic membrane. Each replay cycle during slow-wave sleep sends a burst of activation through the stored pattern, and each burst leaves the synapses in that pattern slightly stronger than they were before the cycle began. The cumulative effect across a full night of slow-wave sleep reinforces precisely the single threads that names depend on, the connections that were too weak to activate during the daytime retrieval attempt. A person who sleeps poorly consolidates poorly, and the connections that were already the most vulnerable, the arbitrary name-to-person links with no semantic anchoring, lose the overnight strengthening they needed most. The consolidation window operates during the hours when the system is free to reorganize without the demands of conscious processing, strengthening the weakest links in the network while the processor is offline. The name you could not retrieve yesterday may retrieve faster tomorrow if the overnight consolidation strengthened the single connection that yesterday's search could not activate quickly enough. Sleep is the maintenance window for the retrieval architecture itself. Each input targets a different bottleneck. Exercise builds the hardware the search runs through. Novel learning maintains the speed of the processor that runs the search. Sleep strengthens the connections the search must find. All three operate on the computational system that produces the retrieval you experience as remembering or forgetting a name. The name was always there. The search was slow. The delay later in the car, the computation completed, and the name arrived. The system works. The system is slow, and the name, when it comes, proves both. Your Tuesday was slow, your data is fine.